Buddhism and Science. Paul Dahlke. Introduction. The purpose of the book. Three kinds of books there are. First, those that give nothing and from which we demand nothing. These constitute the greater portion of the book world, empty entertainment for the idle. Secondly, those books that give the unfamiliar and are unfamiliar to us, that is, demand only our memory. These are manuals of instruction presenting facts. And thirdly, those books that give themselves and demand ourselves. These are the books that are mental nutriment in the real sense of the words, and impart to the entire process of mental development a stimulus which, like the stimulus imparted to a growing tree, never again can be lost. The present book makes claim to belong to the last category. As something experienced by myself, it is meant to become such an experience to others. The mental poverty of our time finds its most accurate expression in the prevalent lack of individual experience. We are not impressed where we ought to be impressed because we allow ourselves to be impressed where in truth there is nothing impressive. We mistake our true interests. The interesting is something in which we have an interest, in which we have a share. But there has been such a derangement of positions that in presence of our true interests we stand stupid spectators, whilst for the interesting in the banal sense we are ready to go through fire and flood. To the average man of today, it is far more interesting to read hair-splitting investigations into the question as to whether Christianity is a branch of Buddhism or Buddhism of Christianity, than to think out and live that which both have taught and continue to teach. All this is inherent in the conditions under which we live at the present time. Thought is ever confronted by life as by a question that of necessity becomes actual in me, the thinker. For as a candle illuminates a certain portion of space and thereby first calls forth question-raising objects, so does thought itself illuminate these stellar spaces and thereby first calls forth question-raising objects. The I is the natural point of departure of every view of the world, being the objective as well as the subjective point of departure. Now that philosophy, in the endeavor to construct a world conception out of pure thought alone, has come to ruin on her own nothingness, natural science has constituted itself the emissary of the world conception idea, and in contradistinction to philosophy has sought to realize it over the head of the I, so to speak. An attempt which, despite all its grandeur, is forever doomed to failure, seeing that as the last to include the I itself in this world theory, the problem is insoluble. Hence the fact that we no longer possess a philosophy such as the ancients and the schoolmen possessed, and do not yet possess a natural science that can give us any genuine aid. Every thinker, every seeker, and every thinker is a seeker, is today in a state of mental interregnum. And it is the hope of this book that, as masses of atmosphere in labile equilibrium frequently at the slightest impulse break into whirling motion, so also the minds of our time that are in this state of labile equilibrium may prove themselves still more susceptible to stimuli and respond, if not exactly with a mental typhoon, at least with a gentle zephyr. Three kinds of men there are. First, the indifferent, comparable to the inert bodies of chemistry. To them applies the saying of Confucius, "Rotten wood cannot be turned." Secondly, the believers, comparable to those chemical bodies whose affinities are satisfied. Insofar as their faith is genuine, to these applies already during their lifetime the parable of beggar Lazarus in Abraham's bosom. And thirdly, there is the thinking class, destitute of faith, corresponding to chemical bodies in the nascent state. To them applies that word of the Buddha, "Painful is all life." Our book has value only for this third, last kind. The indifferent, however highly educated he may be, will never give himself the trouble to think it out, and with the believer it will only provoke contradiction. A thinker destitute of faith, I call him, who at the idea of endlessness, which none who thinks at all can escape, reacts with that psychic uneasiness which may be compared with the purely intellectual uneasiness one experiences in presence of the irrational in mathematics, both, as a matter of fact, being also analogues. The circle of readers of this book is thus circumscribed in advance, but the few for whom it is written, they are the few that count. Three questions there are that before all else occupy every thinking man and always have occupied him. The question, what am I? The question, how must I comport myself? The question, to what end am I here? This what, this how, this to what end, these are the subjects of contention in all mental life. It is not everyone who, like Emperor Augustus of old, can withdraw from this scene of things with a plaudite amici. There are minds to whom life is more than a play, and all that is transient more than a symbol. It is the negative task of this book to show that neither faith nor science supplies such an answer to these questions as can satisfy the thinking man. It is the positive task of this book to show that a solution of these three questions is furnished in the Buddha thought, but in a form so strange at first sight that until now it has achieved no practical importance. Trained one-sidedly to inductive attempts at concepts, we know not how to translate into modern prose these enigmatic formulas of thought. We know not what to make of a nirvana, the epitome of all blessedness and yet no heaven. We know not what to make of a karma that from beginninglessness binds existence to existence and yet is no soul. And so the truest of all teachings, uncomprehended by philosophy, unheeded by natural science, is lost to us and to the needs of our time. The question arises, how comes it that Buddhism has always remained essentially alien to us, a sort of mental curiosity? To this I give the answer, brief and blunt: it is not understood. That is only too painfully evident from the literature published about it. Here I do not at all refer to those commonplace compilations that simply swarm with misconceptions. It is just the best books on the subject which reveal how far removed it is, beyond our powers of apprehension. I am prepared to have reproach brought against me. First, that in many places I have become polemical, and secondly, that I have not sufficiently studied that tone of affected diffidence such as has become the fashion in our books, just in so far as they deal with the theme of a world conception. As to the first point, I can bear witness that nowhere have I indulged in polemics for polemic's sake. It is with the Buddha thought as with many a colossal edifice, whereof the greatness only becomes apparent by comparison with ordinary erections. As in the case of the pyramids of Gizeh, the endless background of the desert offers no fitting standard of measurement for their greatness. So the Buddha thought, when projected upon beginninglessness alone, offers nothing by which its greatness can be measured. One must place by its side other mental structures if one is ever to be able to reveal it in all its stupendous proportions. It is easy to understand that in this case simple comparison must already amount to polemics. As to the second point, my opinion is this: either one has something useful to contribute, in which case one does not need to practice this affected diffidence, or else one has nothing useful to contribute, in which case one doesn't need to write at all. I dare speak thus because I bring nothing of my own, but only speak in the place of a greater. We do not know, but there is no sound reason for doubting that so-and-so, and all such phrases, howsoever couched, by means of which an endlessly considerable probability is intended to be smuggled into the ranks of truth, are quite uncalled for in a teaching like that of the Buddha. Whoso knows, thus it is, simply says thus it is. 1. What is a world theory, and is it necessary? There is present a something given, an actuality, which we designate by the collective name of world. The untutored person and the thinker alike make use of the same expression. This latter is indifferent, acquiring a definite meaning only with reference to a particular explanation, that is, with reference to a view of the world. The impulse to explain actuality, the need of a world theory, a world conception, is deeply embedded in every living being endowed with consciousness. The moment any being has so far developed as to begin to think, it finds itself involved in a huge system within which it seeks to know its way, striving the while to understand it in its various details. This system comes before it in a twofold aspect: on the one hand as something that is, i.e. things, and on the other hand as something that happens, i.e. the play of events among things. A being without a happening attached is as little to be found as a happening without a being. In other words, processes only exist. Here two questions immediately arise. First, what is the world? And second, how does the play of events come about? Both sides of the world picture, and therewith both questions, blend into one question, the question as to adequate causes. As well, the fact that something is here as the fact that something happens requires adequate causes. The adequate cause is the thought necessity given with all mental life. The entire universe in all its parts and processes is to the thinking man a species of marionette show. He sees the puppets dance, but he does not see the strings. Neither does he see that which pulls the strings. The incentive to a view of the world is the craving, so to speak, to get a peep behind the scenes, to spy out nature's secrets, and therewith seize upon the meaning and significance of life itself. This latter is the real object of every world theory. Now, it is quite true that if I do not perceive the meaning and significance of life, I am but little better than the donkey that drags the full sacks to the mill and the empty ones back, without knowing why, in the one case as in the other. I owe it to my dignity as a man to seek out the meaning and significance of life. But this is not all. That I am here is a given fact. Were I not here, had I never been here, not for that would any breach have yawned in the structure of the world. But now that I am here, all turns upon how I conduct myself during this my existence. Not the fact that I am here, but how I employ this existence is the all-important thing. This question as to the how can only be answered in any natural way through the what. I must know what I am and what are the things and beings outside me. I must learn my relations to the external world. I must apprehend the meaning and significance of life before I can possess a genuine canon and standard for my behavior, for my morality. For all morality, whether it find expression in doing or in leaving undone, issues in acts of selflessness. This, however, requires that motives be brought forward, otherwise such an act is either a perverted form of self-seeking like all asceticism, or it is mere training, bearing indeed the outward semblance of morality, in reality, however, having nothing at all to do with it. It is only in virtue of cognition that any act acquires moral value. One can speak of real morality there only where it is a function of cognition. Hence, there can be no morality without comprehension, without a world conception. This is the first reason why a world theory is necessary. But it behoves a being worthy the name of man also to know whether this life is merely a blind adventure or whether it has aim and goal. The thinking man demands to know what he may expect after this life. He insists upon looking beyond this life. He claims an answer to the question, whence? Whither? This demand to look out beyond life, this questioning as to the aim and goal of life, is called religion. As with the query, how must I conduct myself, which permits of being answered in natural fashion then only when I know what I am, so is it with the question, whence am I and whither am I bound? Only when I know what I am can this question also find a natural reply. A genuine religion, like a genuine morality, has its roots in cognition. Both alike must be functions of cognition. Such are the two reasons why for every thinking being a world theory is not only a matter of giving honorable satisfaction to his dignity as a man, but also why it is a positive necessity. In their absence, genuine morality and genuine religion alike are impossible. Now, every backward glance into time, i.e. universal history, as well as every look round us in space, i.e. ethnology, reveals the fact that there never has been, and also that there is not a people destitute of every trace, every touch of morality and religion. The only question is this natural capacity of mankind for morality and religion a veritable function of cognition? The essence of all cognition is the individual. Every act of cognition is always something individual, personal, pertaining to me alone. Were all men to cognize alike, the content of this cognition would still be the individual possession of each and every single person. Cognition separates. Opposite to it stands another function of human nature, emotion. Emotion unites. If things cognizable are the affair of the individual, things emotional have to do with the mass. Every natural capacity of mankind for morality and religion consists altogether of what pertains to the emotions. Here, all morality is founded upon an instinctive feeling of correlation, which finds expression in the well-known saying, "What you would not men did to you, see that you do not them unto," or in the maxim, "So conduct thyself towards others as thou wouldst wish that they should conduct themselves towards thee." The unifying quality of emotion is made manifest in every form of compassion, which latter frequently rises to the pitch of an actual vegetative suffering with the afflicted person. Such facts, open to everyone's observation, awaken in all the instinctive feeling of an inner connection of beings, and yield a natural morality that is purely a function of emotion. It may be asked, could such a morality of emotion suffice humanity? It would suffice a humanity whose development had only reached so far as the capacity for emotion. So soon, however, as a being passes from the stage of the emotional and enters upon the stage of the cognitive, the morality of emotion no longer suffices, as little so as the reasons one is accustomed to give to children suffice the grown man. The emotional holds sway as long as an individual is not yet fully conscious of himself, not yet come to pure reflection. So soon as he is fully conscious, there arises also the need to understand ourselves as well as our morality and religion. Then only may I say that I have morality and religion when I have understood them, when both have become functions of my cognition. So long as this is not the case, so long are religion and morality things of emotion, and these are subject to every conceivable variation. Hence the endless diversity of moralities as well as of religions in the stage of the emotional. Here both, to use the language of current speech, are mere matters of taste, lacking in all inner foundation. Hence also comes all that is unintelligible in the manners and customs connected with morality and religion among foreign peoples of ancient and of modern times. This is not the place to go into details. Every historical record, every account of civilization furnishes abundant examples. Whether upon our globe a state of affairs has ever prevailed in which morality and religion have been exclusively things of emotion, it is impossible to say. The fact remains that at the point where, in our glance backward over the history of the world, man first emerges, the purity of emotional morality and religion is no longer intact. Historical man, as first presented to us in the states of Egypt and Babylonia, already exhibits a morality and religion which are no longer pure functions of emotion, but have now become functions of reflection. This necessity for reflection is given with the essential being of all that is real. As already said, all that is, on the one hand, presents itself as something that is, i.e., a being, and on the other hand, as something that happens, i.e., a becoming, that is, as a process. Wherever something happens, an adequate cause must be present, and the world, by its simple existence, by reason of its very nature as a process, is the standing incitement to comprehension, to reflection, inasmuch as the mind hankers after an adequate cause for all that occurs. The apparent changes in organic being all about me, says Goethe in his Morphology, took a strong hold of my mind. Imagination and nature seem to strive with one another, which of the two should stride forward with the bolder and firmer step. The search after adequate causes is everywhere given as a necessity of thought wherever mental life is found. An adequate cause is required for that which is, just as much as for that which happens. It is that which both presume. To possess a world theory, and therewith a world conception, means to comprehend adequate causes. According to the attitude assumed by mental life toward the question of adequate causes, does it separate off in two main directions: the direction of faith and the direction of science. 2. Faith and a world theory. There is present a something given, the world. It presents itself as an endlessly vast sum of processes. Where there is a process, there is happening. Where something happens, their adequate causes are demanded. Every attempt to comprehend adequate causes leads backwards in endless series, since each cause comprehended is something which itself in turn demands an adequate cause, and so on backwards without ever a conclusion. Faith is that particular form of mental life which from this fact draws the inference that for the human mind a real comprehension is impossible, since behind the physical there stands a something transcendent, a force, with reference to which all life phenomena become that which their name expresses, phenomena of a life which faith for the most part designates by the word God. This force stationed behind the physical, to which faith traces back all that happens, must be an adequate cause in itself, hence something contrary to sense in the fullest meaning of the words. For all that is, without exception, requires an adequate cause. An adequate cause in itself would thus be that something which by its simple existence would give the lie to this thought necessity, inasmuch as itself would be that which would have no adequate cause. When the thought necessity of an adequate cause is thus satisfied with an adequate cause in itself, this just means it is satisfied in a fashion contrary to sense. The essence of all that is contrary to sense consists in this, that when followed out in thought, it deprives itself of the possibility of existence. A mistake in an arithmetical sum is the most familiar form of what is contrary to sense. It is something that in correct thinking is by itself deprived of all possibility of existence. It is something that makes its appearance only that it may appear no more. In like case stands faith. Does it essay to think that in which it believes, then must that present itself to it in one or other relation or form, that is, conceptually. A transcendent, however, that presents itself conceptually is transcendent no longer, but, on the contrary, the one completely conceptualized thing there is in the world, inasmuch as its whole existence just consists of the concept of it. Accordingly, when faith ventures to think, it deprives itself of the possibility of existence. When it does not think, it has no existence as faith, and therefore no existence at all. When, as in these days frequently happens, people complain of the ever-increasing decay of faith, the reason mostly given is that faith does not contain a sufficiency of what is of value to the understanding. The believer must know what, how, and why he believes, and not have his faith based simply upon feeling. But this is somewhat the same as if one should reproach darkness with not containing a sufficiency of light among its ingredients. Is light present? Then there can be no darkness. Is understanding present? Then there can be no faith. Credo ut intelligam is the most vain of all wishes. Pantheism, in its noblest form, that of the Indian Vedanta, endeavors to avoid this dilemma by conceiving of its divine in purely negative terms. But the famous neti, not this, of the Upanishads is a definition too, and so a limitation. Through this, its essential characteristic of itself in being thought out, depriving itself of the possibility of existence, faith takes its place, as third in the trio, along with illusion and error. Illusion is what I call a mistaken view, error what I call a mistaken experience. When I mistake a rope for a snake, a train of ants for a crack in the ground, these are illusions. When I hold infusoria to have their origin in the infusion of hay, or look upon the evening and the morning star as two different orbs, these are errors. Upon this, its community of nature with illusion and error is based another essential characteristic of faith, namely the impossibility, when once it has vanished, of its ever again coming to life. Once the rope on my path, which I formerly mistook for a snake, has been recognized by me for a rope, never again can I voluntarily return to my illusion. I can indeed, by force of imagination, represent it to myself as a snake, but this representation no longer works. It no longer excites fear. And in just the same way, I can quite successfully recall the conditions under which certain optical and acoustic delusions made their appearance, but they are illusions that are dead. The like holds good of error, and for a third of faith. People who call for a resuscitation of vanished faith, and by some means or other hope to see it effected, know not what it is that they hope and call for. They are calling for the restoration of a vanished ignorance, an utter inconceivability. Now there exists one great distinction between faith on the one hand and illusion and error on the other. In this respect, namely, that the two latter have the physical, the material for their object, hence can be checked and set right by this, that is, by reality. Faith, however, that has for its object the non-physical, the non-material, which is just whatever the believer chooses to conceive it to be, cannot be checked and set right by reality. On the contrary, the believer interprets the entire world in accordance with his concept, devours, so to speak, the world's entire content of reality, and sets up a view of the world that is unreal, seeing that he interprets the physical from the transcendental standpoint, that is, abnormally, and therefore he is never in the position to be set right by reality, since he never can knock up against contradictions. One must know that one does not know before one can let oneself be taught. In perfect accordance with this essential feature of faith, so far as the theory of knowledge is concerned, is its morality and religion. Both are contrary to sense. The essence of all morality is to be found in selflessness. Every act of selflessness requires a motive. To possess a motive, one must exercise cognition, comprehension. As a matter of fact, the essential nature of every faith morality is selfish, despite all its acts of renunciation. Here one practices renunciation like a man who stints himself of a certain amount of money and invests it in a lottery. As he parts with his money that he may win back more in its place, so here the believer gives up money, goods, life, yea, honor and truth, everything, if so be he may draw the first prize above. The essence of all religion consists in the search for the aim and goal of life. This search faith satisfies by referring life as a whole to as something transcendent, but the existence of the transcendent is nothing else but the concept of it. To refer life as a whole to a transcendent thus means nothing but to refer itself to itself, which, so to speak, is the analytical expression for ignorance. Further development of these ideas is not essential to our task. Here we have only to bear well in mind that, as the world theory from the standpoint of faith is one contrary to sense, so also is its morality and its religion. All three are functions of a nescience, and therefore void of actuality. 3. Science and a world theory. There is present a something given, the world. With reference to this something given, science takes up a position that in its own way is every whit as arbitrary as again in its way is that of religion. With this difference, however, that whereas the latter, so to speak, turns the clock of mental life backward, science would fain turn it forward. The play of world events with equal justice may be held to declare that we comprehend adequate causes as to declare that we do not comprehend them, inasmuch as all we may have comprehended as the adequate cause of any life phenomenon, itself on its part demands an adequate cause, and so on backwards ad infinitum. In short, every adequate cause is of a secondary nature. From this science argues as follows. It is a fact that we comprehend adequate causes in certain respects up to a certain degree. Consequently, perfect comprehension is possible, everything depending simply on patience and correct methods. With this claim of the comprehensibility and principle of life phenomena, science takes upon itself the proud task of itself working out a world theory from the foundation upwards. Comprehensibility and principle of life phenomenon is that standpoint with reference to actuality which is given for every science without exception. On any other hypothesis, science as science has no justification whatever for its existence. Science, if it is to be what its name implies, is that which furnishes knowledge. Knowledge can only be furnished where things can be completely demonstrated, made tangible to sense. That, however, is only possible if nothing lies hidden in things that is not perceptible by sense. Hence, science, if she does not wish to gainsay her own right to exist, must proceed upon the arbitrary hypothesis that there is nothing in the play of world events that is not perceptible to the senses. And if really there is something of the sort there, then for her it is merely the not yet demonstrable, which later on, with patience, with improvements in methods, will also be achieved. This is the position which science takes up with reference to the play of world events, the foundation on which her whole superstructure is erected. Science is possible there only where there is the sensible, the demonstrable, where there is something so constituted that I can class it with others of its kind. And all science, to put it briefly, is just the endeavor to make tangible to sense the entire play of world events. In support of this standpoint in Principle of Science, I cite the following passage from W. Ostwald's Schule der Chemie. Pupil. These are only properties. What I mean, however, is that which lies at the root of all properties. teacher. This then ought to remain behind when you have thought away all properties from the matter. Well, think away all its properties from a piece of sugar, color, shape, hardness, weight, taste, and so forth. What then remains over? Nothing. For it is only through its properties that I can recognize that there is something there. You must get rid of the notion that apart from the properties of a thing, there is anything at all to be found beneath them that is higher or more real than the properties. From this rejection of all that is not perceptible to sense, it follows that science may not recognize as adequate causes for that which is, even as for that which happens, in short, for all the phenomena of life, anything else but other phenomena of life. If for faith, the thought necessity, an adequate cause, becomes an adequate cause in itself, a pure absolute, for science it becomes a pure relative. Anything is an adequate cause purely in its relation to another phenomenon of life, and with reference to itself, another phenomenon of life again is the adequate cause. In brief, the adequate cause is here just as much an effect as a cause. With this rejection in principle of all that is not perceptible to sense, science rejects all actual energies. For an actual energy can never be anything perceptible to sense, the latter ever and always necessitating the question as to its adequate cause. In the universe as constructed for itself by science, the actuating impulse is simply the various differences that obtain in situation and tension, which are equally as countless in number as the countless processes with which they are given. The play of world events in its entirety becomes a stupendous process of compensation, and all values become simply values of relation. Here nothing has sense and meaning by itself, but only as it first receives them from others. The purely scientific standpoint can only be the materialistic one, along with which of necessity is given the mechanical mode of apprehending the play of world events. In the mechanical apprehension of things, the play of world events becomes a falling. Every fall demonstrates the absence of actual forces by the fact that in its downward course it can be computed in advance. The aim and object of all science is computation in advance. The ability to do this finds its due expression in scientific law. The proof that upon this path one had arrived at a world theory would thus be an absolutely and universally valid law. Such a law science does not possess. Every law, without exception, is an abstraction from experience and may be swept away again by fresh experiences. Now, it is true, modern physics lays claim to one universal law, the law of the conservation of energy. We shall have to return to this law later on. Here, in passing, be it only said. First, that the law of the conservation of energy has by no means been arrived at upon the legitimate path of science, that is, upon the path of induction, but has been found intuitively. Secondly, the law of the conservation of energy is nothing but a reading of the facts on one hand by way of definite compromise, on the other, valid only for a limited domain of nature. The compromise is as follows. Were the law of the conservation of energy really a law abstracted from experiences and absolutely valid, it would be proven by the complete passing over, without any remainder, of one phenomenon of life into another, as for instance by the transformation of a process of heat into a process of motion, and physics would have a right to draw the conclusion of an analogy between this and other processes. The play of world events as pure relation values, its potential comprehensibility, would be proven by a single transformation without residue of heat into motion and motion back into heat, that is, by a single completely reversible process. But the idea of reversible processes has practical and theoretical possibility only in an absolutely closed system. Such a thing, however, is not to be had in the world of actuality. All things here, without exception, stand in relation to one another, and these mutual relations do not admit of total suspension even for a single moment of time. Thus, at no time can one get anything but approximately closed systems. Therefore, at no time can one attain to anything but approximately correct results. Every attempt to demonstrate practically a completely reversible process works with minimum losses, which the physicist, to be sure, lays to the charge of the procedure adopted, but which the thinker is equally justified in interpreting as a loss of energy. No matter what the exactitude with which the experiment is carried out, no matter how small in value the loss, it is always there. There is no such thing as a completely reversible process. One can only derive a law of the conservation of energy from the facts, if, for thought, the same is already given. From experiments alone, inductively, it would be as impossible to arrive at a law of the conservation of energy as it would be to arrive at the concept of the circle solely from the concept of the polygon. The circle must be given beforehand as ultimate concept, Grenzbegriff, and in exactly the same way the law of the conservation of energy must be given beforehand as ultimate concept, Grenzbegriff, if the experiments are to lead up to it. Thus, it was with Robert Mayer's great intuition. It was a thing given. And this intuition was taken up by science and worked out, because here was given it a means of proving with scientific appliances the impossibility of a perpetuum mobile. Perpetual motion, however, is the violation of the law of adequate cause transferred to the domain of the physical. That is one side of the matter. The other is that the law of the conservation of energy, conformable with its nature, can only possess validity in the domain of processes reversible and not dependent upon time, for in a non-reversible process there would lie no possibility whatever of its proof. Here, this is quite enough to signalize the nature of the law of the conservation of energy. In the conception of the play of world events as yielded by this law, the physicist turns his eyes entirely away from the real, active energies of the play of world events. He confines himself entirely to what is exhibited to sense, the motions. He takes them for the forces themselves, but is entitled to do so only so long as he keeps clear before him the fact that it is only a reading that is in question and derives therefrom what alone can be derived: work done. Work done, however, is not energy itself, but the reaction from energies, and that which the physicist calls the world picture of energetics is, in point of fact, void of all energies. The entire world picture of energetics is no actual thing, but in the strictest sense a thing reactual, if such a word may be coined, which as such has no title whatever to be used as a world theory. Should nevertheless this occur, then those consequences follow about which we shall speak later. So long as science abides by actuality, she can say nothing else but that every attempt to trace back completely one phenomenon of life to another, that is, to represent the play of world events in the form of pure relation values, slips into an endless series, and what is most of all worthy of remark, each member of this endless series is itself in turn the point of departure for a new endless series. So that in the last analysis, the fact of this limitless comprehensibility of the phenomena of life remains as the one real problem of science. And every science that is in earnest and does not merely seek to avail itself of technique at the very outset must ask itself the question: this limitless onward movement which every point of departure yields, start where we may, has it or has it not a conclusion? To be able to judge of that, one must possess some firm standing ground from which to look out and see whether this unceasing progression really is progress. On this journey upon the high seas of knowledge, one must have a landmark by which to steer. Such a possibility, however, is excluded, and excluded by science itself. For, as already said, science as such has standing only where the hypothesis of potential comprehensibility, of the absence of all that is not perceptible to sense, holds good. In other words, where the play of world events admits of being resolved without remainder into relation values. Such a landmark, however, could only be something which itself did not admit of being resolved into pure relation values, but was a constant in itself, an unconditioned constant. Were science, however, to admit the existence of such a something, she would be cutting the ground from under her own feet. The whole value of science as such resides in its pure relativity, in the liability of its values, even as the value of faith resides in the fixity of its one value. From all this it follows that in science itself absolutely nothing can be found that might serve it to prove whether or not there is genuine progress toward knowledge. That is, whether all these endless series, which every experiment and every piece of thought opens up, do or do not proceed toward a final conclusion. At this stage, one view of the matter has precisely as much justification as the other, and ignorabimus just as much and just as little value as the most flamboyant optimism. We cannot know. It is, so to speak, entirely a matter of taste as to the sense in which one chooses to interpret these endless series. In full consonance with this is the value which science possesses in relation to morality and religion. Whoso will give mankind morality and religion must give it something in which it can find support. Both morality and religion at bottom are nothing but a support in the wide waste of infinitudes. Every thinking man craves for such a support. If it is lacking, then for the real thinker a condition supervenes that is all as unbearable as that physical one, when for the moment a person has lost all possibility of learning the lie of his surroundings, as, for instance, when he wakes up confused out of a deep sleep and does not know how to find his way anywhere. Here as there it is, the pure anguish of thought that comes over us in such a condition, an anguish that will not let us rest until we have again constructed the mental support, again established continuity in thought with the whole. If faith fabricates this support in a manner contrary to sense, and consequently projects in consonance with her nature a morality and religion that are contrary to sense, science as a whole on its part is nothing but the attempt to fabricate for itself a support in law. Scientific law, however, yields a support solely with reference to a theory of knowledge. Hence, never under any circumstances can science project moral and religious values. It would be a contradiction of her own nature. Could she do so, she would no longer be science, i.e., the form of mental life which must comprehend the entire play of world events in the form of relation values. Where there exists nothing but relation values, there can exist no support in itself, and therefore no morality or religion. Science is a moral and a religious, and the layman as well as the scientist himself ought ever to keep this clearly before his mind. The efforts made in our day to carve out, so to speak, the results of science to suit religious ends as modern monism seeks to do only go to show how necessary is such an admonition. From the continuity of life, expounded in the materialistic sense as a cell, men seek to deduce the idea that we ourselves live on in the generations to come, somewhat as the manure lives on in the plant it has manured. But these are such playthings of thought as only are possible where one is operating with what is wholly divorced from actuality, that is, with the empty concept of life. To seek to derive moral and religious values from science is, as the Indian saying has it, to milk the bull by the horns. Now both faith and science alike have the same starting point, the thing given the world. The question then arises, how can it be possible that with reference to this given thing, each should take up such a directly opposite position? How comes it that the one apprehends the adequate cause of the play of world events as a pure absolute, while the other apprehends it as a pure relative? At this point we come face to face with the Buddha thought and its significance for mental life.